So you're looking to add video to your bag of skills and you don't really know where to start. Well, you're in luck. I was once a photographer that was looking to get into video as well. So let me give you a couple of my basics. Let's go. Come on. So there's a few things you need to know before you get started on your video journey. Just like photography, you can always shoot in automatic and sometimes it'll turn out fine. I wouldn't hate on you for it because a lot of times that's the only way to get the shot in the moment. But here are some super simple steps that you can take to create a really high quality image. It really doesn't take much. Okay, the very first concept is going to be shutter speed. If you've been doing any sort of photography, you understand the effect that shutter speed has on motion blur in your pictures. Too low and your pictures end up a little blurry, and too high and everything ends up really still. There is a good balance of that when you're shooting video. It really is about achieving that specific amount of motion blur that makes it feel like a movie. The concept is super simple. For a normal amount of motion blur on a 24 frames per second video or 24p, you would need to just double your shutter speed compared to the frames per second. So for instance, 24 frames per second would be 1/48 would be appropriate, or 1/50 if 48 isn't an option. It isn't with a lot of cameras, and so on. So you'll go with something like 120p. That would be 1/240 to get the appropriate shutter. Now, I have to warn you, as you go further and further with your slow motion, meaning when you go with higher frames per second, you'll see a lot less motion blur. It's just something that's very specific to when you do slow motion, but motion blur isn't exactly what you'd be looking for anyway when you're doing slow motion. Now, pro tip about shutter speed. This is something that a lot of people leave out when they do their shutter speed videos or tutorials. You can crank your shutter speed up higher and your image ends up looking a little jittery, but it really doesn't look that bad. So if you have a choice between losing the shot or getting the shot with high shutter speed, just get the shot with high shutter speed or auto. Some instances can't be repeated, and especially with live events, you really don't want to miss the moment. In a perfect world, you'd be able to dial it in every single time, but sometimes time and circumstance won't permit you to do so. Shutter speed is going to lead us into our next topic, which is actually an item: ND filters. You should be fairly familiar with what ND filters are. They help to control the amount of light coming through without changing your aperture. It also allows you to set your ISO to whatever ISO works best with your camera. I know that Blackmagic is like 400, and with Canon cameras, if you're shooting in log, you want to keep it at 800. And 800 oftentimes is way too high to be shooting with any sort of light outside. So you want to put an ND filter on to control the amount of light coming in so you can keep your ideal ISO and ideal shutter speed. You keep that same amount of motion blur regardless of your other settings. You can kind of keep them locked in. It's not always possible, but the ND filters also make it a lot easier. And as you move along a little further into cinematography and you get more specific and dial in your stuff a little better, you'll notice that a lot of cinema cameras have ND filters built into the body already, which is literally my favorite thing about cinema cameras. I love them so much, but that's for another video. Okay, so a lot of you have subscribed to my channel based on this next topic, which is log footage. And log footage is what pretty much every single movie is shot in. And anything that people want to be professional is shot in log footage or raw and then converted to log. I've made extensive videos about how to expose Canon C-Log 3, and it can apply to a lot of different types of logs. Just interchange the ISO number and a couple other values, and it'll work out for other types of log. But the link will be in the description below if you're trying to figure out how to expose C-Log3 and then edit it afterwards. I won't lie to you, dealing with log footage can be a real pain, and it can be very, very time consuming. Exposing it isn't always straightforward, but once you get the hang of it, it works kind of like raw photos, not exactly like raw photos, but it gives you a lot more ability to color your pictures the way that you want. And it allows you to manipulate your scene so that, for instance, you can make a daylight scene seem almost like nighttime, or vice versa. Log footage creates that extra bit of dynamic range by pushing all of your highlights and shadows towards the middle of that exposure range. Meaning when you expose your footage and you bring it over to computer, the footage will look super gray until you start your edit. Okay, and a pro tip when it comes to log footage, not all situations require log. And I learned this the hard way. I started using log footage way too early on and exposed it with my eyeballs instead of actually understanding that I need to expose a little bit higher with a lot of the log footage. And it ended up looking really bad, but standard profile actually looks really, really good on most cameras. The color science I find of most cameras are all catching up and looking either lifelike or at least attractive. So don't feel the pressure to shoot log all the time and then get mad at me because I made all these videos about log and you thought it was easy. It's not easy. But once you get the hang of it, I think it'll be worthwhile. It just isn't necessary depending on the kind of content you're creating. 2 more to go. So next up is ISO, and it's something that photographers should be very used to, and by photographers I mean you. With video, you definitely want to lock down your ISO. Nothing is worse than watching a video and watching the ISO fluctuate throughout the video to compensate for the changing light. Just lock it down and the video starts to look a little better. With standard or non-log footage, you can crank your shutter up as high as you need to, as long as you're comfortable with the amount of noise that it's creating. With log footage, it can be a little more complicated. It definitely benefits you to stick to the native ISO. The native ISO is the value that each manufacturer sets for its specific log, and you can always look it up. These are usually easy to find. So the value will allow your camera to get the most amount of dynamic range and therefore the highest quality image your camera will allow for. So for instance, with Canon C-Log3 and Sony S-Log3, the native ISO is 800. And the further you move away from that 800, the less dynamic range your image will have if you're shooting in log. So it definitely benefits you to keep the value at the designated native ISO, but if you have to change it a little bit to save your image, then definitely do so. Just know that there's consequences for these types of actions. You'll lose a little dynamic range. Our very last item will be focus or autofocus. Our hybrid cameras and modern cameras now have great autofocus. They can snap and get your picture within a fraction of a second, but that typically doesn't work so well for video. Snappy focus pulls from one subject to the next or trying to catch up with your subject can make for very uncinematic looking footage. Uncinematic? Is that a word? Well, anyways, a trick to making things look a little better while still using autofocus is something I do with almost all my cameras that I shoot primary video with, is slowing down your autofocus speed when you're doing video. This is extremely important because the pulls will look and feel a little more natural. It's not gonna make it look like any sort of Hollywood movie, but it definitely makes it look more natural than if your camera were to just snap over to another subject and then back again. You've seen it a lot of times, I'm sure. Bad news if you're in love with autofocus like I am. The industry standard is still manual focus. In fact, as I mentioned before, there is a job on Hollywood sets that is a manual focus puller, a person that stands there turning the wheel on a remote to change focus from one subject to the other. And if you think about it, it's pretty important to not have the focus shutter and change. It can really take you out of a story when the focus isn't right. It shows an amount of intentionality when the focus smoothly pulls from one subject to the next. So it makes sense. But if you're doing something like this and you don't have a camera that has great eye autofocus, it's not a bad idea to get your focus locked in and leave it. Speaking of locking in, I almost forgot. Lock in your white balance. Try to figure out whether you want your scene to be warm or cool and just lock it in to one point. Really don't want to see that fluctuating color constantly. It just looks unprofessional. You don't want to be unprofessional. All right, I'm tired now. Let me know if this video is helpful at all. Leave any sort of questions in the comment section. Like it if you like the video. Leave on one of my old videos for white noise so I can get the views. Anyways, bye.